Well, the theme of this year's Heritage Open Days is edible Abingdon, and I wanted to talk about some of the ways in which archaeologists can find out about what people ate in the past. What people eat is very important to them. In a way, it defines part of your identity. An archaeologist has got various different ways of discovering about what people ate in the past, and one of those is by digging up the bones of animals. Particularly in this area, animal bones survive in the soil very, very well. They'll survive in perfect condition for thousands of years if they're in the right place. And by excavating sites and collecting the animal bones and then counting them and measuring them and analysing them, you can find out an awful lot about the animal part of people's past diet. The main species that we find bones of are sheep or goat, cattle and pig, and those were the main animals that were farmed right from the start of farming in this country about 6,000 years ago. And by counting up the bones you can see whether they had more sheep or more cattle or whatever. You can also you can tell how old an animal was when it was killed by how well developed its bones were, and by plotting those patterns you can get some idea of whether animals were being killed for meat, if they were lambs maybe that were killed quite young, or whether they were being kept for meat or wool, because then they would be kept and not killed until they were much older. So you can learn a lot about what kinds of things they were keeping animals for, and particularly whether it was for meat or for dairying. Another thing you can do is when animals are butchered, the knives that are used will leave marks on the bones, and you can get some idea of how the animal was cut up and what sort of joints of meat they cooked. You also find the bones of wild animals, and that gives you an idea of what they were, what wild animals they may have been capturing and eating. Deer, for instance, are quite commonly found on archaeological sites. They perhaps wouldn't have been eaten a lot of the time, but they certainly were eaten. Also, by sieving the soil, you can find very small bones of less, much smaller creatures. For instance, birds. A site in Abingdon in Sturt Street, which was excavated, and they sieved a lot of soil, and from medieval pits they found the bones of domestic fowl, chickens, ducks, and even more exotic things like swans and various wildfowl. And it seems quite likely that swans were eaten quite regularly at that time. You can also find, and these are very, very, very small often, is the bones of fish. Again, the same site in Sturt Street in Abingdon showed that they were eating both sea fish like mackerel and river fish like pike and perch. So just by looking at the bones and studying them, you can find an awful lot out about what people were eating. Another recent advance has been in studying the isotopes which are found in bones. These are the chemicals which are absorbed by an animal or a person when they're alive, and they pick up chemicals that are in the soil, and from that you can tell what kind of diet they had. So you can tell what kind of conditions animals were grazing in, and also whether the kinds of things that people were eating, whether they had a lot of marine foods in their diet, or whether they how much meat they were eating and that kind of thing. And that's quite a new field of study, and I think there's a lot of potential for going back to things that have been dug up a long time ago and which are in the museum stores, and studying them again using new techniques which are advancing quite rapidly. So that's a very brief summary of what you can tell from digging up animal bones. And in the next section I'll talk about what you can learn from studying the preserved remains of ancient plants and what those can tell us about our diet or people's diet in the past.